Most teaching staff make their lecture notes available online. There will be a conference here next summer on using the web for academic research.
The university has a world-renowned school of archaeology.
Successful applicants will work with a large team of researchers.
Higher numbers of patients were infected than during previous outbreaks of the illness. Higher numbers of patients.
The final year will consist of 4 taught courses and 1 project. He started his tutorial presentation right on time.
The nearest automatic teller is in front of the anatomy labs.
Newspapers are supported primarily by the sale of advertising space.
Sydney is Australia's largest city, chief port and cultured centre.
The shuttle was designed to be a space truck. It's a multi-purpose vehicle. We've done a tremendous number of different things with it. It's the most versatile space vehicle that has ever been built. We've used it to launch satellites. We've used it to repair satellites in orbit and put them back into orbit. We've used it to capture satellites and bring them back to Earth for repair. We've outfitted it with the Space Lab built by our European partners and used it before the era of the space station to do scientific research. We used it as part of our partnership with the Russians, which is still continuing, first as part of the Mir space station, where we actually prolonged the useful life of Mir by several years through logistical supply visits with the shuttle. And now, of course, we're using it to build the new International Space Station, which is a huge international partnership.
In an article that you wrote that I just read, you said you wished you could take everyone back to decades ago to look at the Florida Keys.
50 years ago, think about how much change has taken place in that short period of time. We have managed to consume on the order of 90% of the big fish in the ocean, the tunas, the swordfish, the sharks. They're mostly gone. Until recently, people have had the belief that there isn't much we puny human beings could do to change the nature of the ocean, but in fact, we have, not just because of what we've been taking out, and the destructive means often applied to take fish and other creatures from the sea, but also what we're putting into the sea, either directly or what we put into the atmosphere that falls back into the sea.
So if you were going to give a grade on the health of the oceans today, what would it be?
Well, it depends on which aspect. Across the board, the oceans are in trouble. It's hard for me to assign a specific grade, maybe C-.
What nutritional guidelines should we be following?
Well, probably the best source of nutritional guidelines are those that are issued by the American Cancer Society or the National Cancer Institute. And the American Cancer Society, for example, offers 4 really basic, simple nutrition guidelines. The first guideline, which in my mind is the most important, is to choose most of the foods that you eat from plant sources. And we can talk in more detail about that in a moment. The second guideline is to limit your intake of high-fat foods, particularly from animal sources. The third guideline is to be physically active and achieve a normal, healthy body weight. And the final guideline is to limit consumption of alcoholic beverages if you choose to drink at all.
So, Susan, one of the things we always hear about from the American Cancer Society is this 5-a-day recommendation. Maybe if you could explain to our listening audience what that actually means.
The 5-a-day recommendation is a very simple way of communicating the message to increase consumption of these plant foods. And what 5-a-day means is 5 servings per day of fruits and vegetables in total. And some people misunderstand this guideline, and they may think it's okay if I have 5 glasses of fruit juice a day and I've met my 5-a-day guideline. But the goal is really to choose both fruits and vegetables as part of the 5-a-day guideline, to vary the fruits and vegetables that you eat on a daily basis. And that alone is a very major step forward in terms of reducing your risk for cancer.
What organ do cardiologists specialize in? What organ do cardiologists specialize in?
If telescopes are used to locate distant objects, what instrument is employed to magnify minuscule objects?
Which kind of punishment for a crime is the less severe? And
How many
which kind of punishment for a crime is the less severe? An imprisonment or community service?
How many sides are there in a bilateral agreement?
Which is the longest, a decade, a millennium, or a century?
A manufacturing process releases noxious gases. What is the most important safety measure for workers at this plant? Ensuring good ventilation or appropriate footwear?
A list of events placed in time order is usually described as what?
If a figure is hexagonal, how many sides does it have? What key mineral makes seawater different from fresh water?
In the animal kingdom, is the purpose of camouflage to attract a mate, to find food, or to hide?
Scientists are discovering that when you touch someone, you communicate very specific emotions such as sympathy, disgust, gratitude, or even love. The current issue of the scientific journal Emotion features a series of studies about touch. Reporter Michelle Trudeau touched base with the lead researcher.
Psychologist Matt Hertenstein from DePaul University in Greencastle, Indiana, decided to study touch while he was watching parents interacting with their babies, making faces and cooing sounds, squeezing, stroking, nuzzling them.
And all of a sudden it struck me one day, and I thought, I wonder if touch can communicate distinct emotions, much like the face and the voice.
Decades of research has been done on the face and the voice and the distinct emotions that they communicate. But touch had been relatively neglected by researchers until Hertenstein stepped in and began his experiments.
We invited 2 participants into the lab, and we put a curtain up between those 2 people.
So they couldn't see or hear each other. One participant, the sender, was told to try and communicate 12 different emotions, one by one, to the other participant, the receiver.
The receiver would put his or her arm underneath the curtain onto the sender's side.
The sender would then touch the receiver's forearm, trying to communicate the specific emotion, such as envy, fear, love, embarrassment, anger, gratitude, pride, disgust. The receiver had to then decide which emotion was being communicated.
About 20 years ago, Kantanger and Barry Johnson came up with 750 chemicals that could harm the brain during development. Nobody has since then dared to update that number. It's just a guess today. There has to be more than 1,000 if there was 750 20 years ago. But the problem is also that we have put too little emphasis in this type of research. For example, it has taken so far the OECD 10 years to devise a battery of tests that they could recommend for systematic testing of chemicals for developmental neurotoxicity. That battery, has not yet been completed and authorized by OECD, so it's taking way too long because it is complicated. But there is so much at stake. Children are just losing IQ points and losing their concentration span, memory or motor functions. But in the present world where there's so much emphasis on knowledge and brain functions, this can also translate into dollars. The EPA has calculated that every time a child loses 1 IQ point because of chemical pollution, it costs society something like $8,000 or $10,000.
If you think about light bulbs, they're an enormous infrastructure. They're in every building in the world, more or less. They have kind of a privileged position above us, around us. They can see, if you think about it, most parts of any room. The kind of key was to say, well, what if we consider a light bulb not to be a light bulb, but actually to be a digital projector? It just happens to be really low resolution. In fact, it's a 1 by 1 pixel digital projector. You turn on the wall switch, and a giant pixel comes out and paints your room. Okay, well, that's ludicrous, but what if you put a higher resolution projector inside that same familiar glass bulb? Well, now you have a device that can illuminate. If you turn on all the pixels the same color, you still have a light bulb in the usual sense. But if you turn on the pixels different amounts and different colors, then you're kind of projecting information out into the world. And if at the same time that you're doing that, you put a little tiny camera inside the bulb, then not only is information flowing out of the glass, but you're collecting optical information. So screw one of those into every one of these fixtures, and suddenly you have a means, potentially, to put display and interaction everywhere throughout the world.
We are led to believe that basically much of eastern North America was heavily cloaked in mature forest that today we covet as old growth, and yet at one time it was the sort of ancestral botanical blanket that covered much of certainly Massachusetts and New England. Certainly one of the first things that happened as increasing waves of colonists arrived was the need to clear the land. And this clearing of the land is something that started really in the form of small subsistence farms. The timber was used for building houses, for building ships, for firewood, for all manner of things. The boulders of the glacial erratic stones that were so much a part of the New England landscape are today sort of what we find in the lattice work of stone walls that one can find practically anywhere on the landscape if it's in a relatively untouched condition. By the early part of the 19th century, it's thought that generally the zenith of clearing had taken place sometime in the 1830s, 1840s, and the trees and the forests were essentially clear-cut to an extent that is almost unbelievable.
One seminal difference in policy remains. The Coalition has not matched what is Labour's most important innovation promise. That is to bring together responsibilities for innovation, industry, science and research under one single federal minister. Innovation responsibilities currently lie within the powerful Department of Education and Science, and while there is a separate industry department, it has little influence within Cabinet. This has hampered policy development and given Australia's innovation policies a distinctly science and research bias. It is the scientists, rather than the engineers, who call the tune in innovation policy in Canberra. So it's no surprise our policies are all about boosting government-funded research and later commercialising their results.
We've decided to adopt, just as a loose theme for the course, a biological theme, so that you can see the connections between chemistry and biology and the things that you might consider doing in the future. We want you to think about the molecules that are relevant to your body, the processes that occur in your body, the chemistry that's going on, and how energy plays a role. And we divided the course into 4 sections, and after each section there will be a midterm. The first one, or an exam. The first one is about matter.
So what influences consumers in different parts of the world? Many factors affect how we as individuals and societies live, buy, and consume. And it should be readily apparent that culture has a profound impact on the way consumers perceive themselves, the products they buy and consume, and the processes by which those products should be purchased, and the organizations that sell those products.
We're not running out of oil. The first thing one can say with absolute confidence is that we're not about to run out of oil. We're definitely not. But what we are approaching is the end of the first half. And this is one way to describe it. And this chapter in history lasted about 150 years since the first oil was produced. And we're coming to the end of that. And you have to find oil before you can produce it. And when we look back in history, we can find that the peak of discovery was in 1964. And that the discovery of oil has been falling ever since, relentlessly. And it's been falling despite a worldwide search, always aimed at the biggest and best prospects. No one's looking for the smallest and the worst, the biggest and the best. It's been falling despite amazing technological and geological advances. We understand this business so much more than we did. And finally, it's been falling despite a very happy economic environment whereby most of the cost of exploration is written off against tax. So I would say in view of all of those incentives and all of those benefits, if discovery has actually been falling relentlessly, there is no good reason to think that this trend is going to change direction. So, in other words, we've passed the peak.
I have chronic pain, and at times this is severe, but this is managed with opiates. I know the general public has a very perverted view of opiates because they think street addiction, heroin, drug smugglers. However, if prescribed correctly by doctors in the right dose for your height and weight, and you manage it well yourself, I haven't increased my dose of 80 milligrams of morphine in the last 18 years. So that's a fairly good illustration that, no, you don't double it every 10 minutes the way the general public think. And also it's very well looked after by the government. I have to present myself to my GPs, who all get to know me very well, every 30 days, and they have to phone Canberra to have authorisation, and I get my monthly dose of opiates to keep me going for the next lot.
I should say one more thing about theory. It's great to discover theory, but you have to lose a lot. And you may have noticed, or maybe you didn't, how much you lose. Partly you don't notice it much because here at the university everybody's dedicated to theory. And what's left out is perception, because you use your mind, not your eyes. Skill, you're not supposed to have any particular sort of bodily kind of skills. There's a kind of mental thing, but let's not call that skill. I'm just calling skill the way you cope with everyday stuff that you use and so forth. Intuition, it's not fair to have intuition. I mean, you can have intuition, but it's not theory. It's not something that everybody has to believe until you can put it into language and argue for it. Gets rid of emotions, the body, tradition.
My PhD student, Elaine Chong, did what was called a meta-analysis, where you analyse the literature very carefully to see what evidence there is to suggest that what we eat, particularly in terms of antioxidants, prevents you getting macular degeneration.
Because ophthalmologists have been using antioxidants quite a lot.
That's right. There have been studies looking at whether antioxidant supplements slow the progression once you have the disease. Whereas this study was looking at trying to stop you getting it.
So what meiosis does for every species is generate a lot of diverse individuals with different capabilities, in the hope that by having a population with very diverse individuals, that at least some of them will be competent to survive. And it's wildly successful. Almost every species on this planet has a way to create genetically diverse gametes, and they use meiosis to do that. Okay, so meiosis is extremely important in the evolution of life and the survival of it.
So far in our discussion of chemical reactions, we have assumed that these reactions only go in one direction, the forward direction, from left to right as we read it in an equation. That's why our arrow points from left to right. Reactants react together to make products. However, this is not exactly how things occur in nature. In fact, practically every chemical reaction is reversible, meaning the products can also react together to reform the reactants that they were made of. So instead of writing that single arrow facing from left to right, a more appropriate symbol would be a double arrow, one going from left to right and one going from right to left. Reactants are continuously reacting to form products, but at the same time, as those products are formed, they remake the reactants. They're both going simultaneously, forming each other. This is what we would call a state of equilibrium.
I think the importance of creativity today really reflects a fundamental shift in the nature of the economy. You know, in the old days, wealth was created because in the industrial era, you manufactured something, you got economies of scale, you had long production runs, you were really efficient. You know, you could get a Model T any color just so long it was black, right? So there was standardization. And there was a whole set of assumptions about how to manage, how to create an organization, you know, a typical kind of hierarchical organization to make sure that things ran smoothly. Well, that may be great for a relatively stable era of history, relatively stable, but now things are fundamentally unstable. And so we need less economies of scale and more economies of discovery, which means that the management approach, the organizational approach, has got to shift as well.
You must submit your assignments by next Friday at the latest.
The time of the maths lecture has been changed to 10:30.
Final year business students have to write a 5,000-word essay on market trends.